The first time I met Margaret Whitmore, I should have recognized the warning signs. It was Thanksgiving 2018, and I was nervous about meeting my girlfriend Emma's family for the first time. Emma had warned me that her mother could be a bit particular, but I dismissed it as typical family dynamics. After all, I was 32 years old, a successful marketing director at a Fortune 500 company, and I'd always gotten along well with parents. How difficult could one woman be? I was about to find out. Margaret answered the door of her pristine colonial home in Westchester County with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was 63 years old, impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater and pearls, with silver hair styled in a perfect bob. Everything about her screamed old money and social status, from her manicured nails to her designer shoes. "You must be Daniel," she said, extending a limp hand for me to shake. "Emma has told me so much about you." The way she said it made it clear that whatever Emma had shared hadn't impressed her. But I was determined to make a good impression, so I smiled warmly and complimented her beautiful home. "Yes, it's been in the family for generations," she replied coolly. "We believe in maintaining certain standards." That was my first clue about Margaret's worldview. She lived in a universe where bloodlines mattered, where social status was inherited rather than earned, and where people like me, middle-class kids who'd worked their way up through scholarships and determination, were viewed with suspicion. My name is Daniel Rodriguez, and I grew up in a working-class family in Queens. My father was a mechanic, my mother was a school secretary, and they'd sacrificed everything to give me and my sister opportunities they'd never had. I'd earned a full scholarship to Columbia, graduated summa cum laude, and built a successful career in marketing. I was proud of my background and the values my parents had instilled in me. Margaret, however, saw my background as a liability. Over the course of that first dinner, she subjected me to what I later realized was an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. Where had I gone to school? What did my parents do for work? What neighborhood had I grown up in? Each answer seemed to confirm her worst suspicions about me. But the real test came when she asked about my 5-year plan. "Emma is at a crucial point in her career," Margaret said, cutting her turkey with surgical precision. "She's being considered for partnership at her law firm, and she needs to make smart decisions about her future. I hope you understand the importance of not holding her back." The implication was clear. I was a potential obstacle to Emma's success, someone who might drag her down to my level rather than elevate her to Margaret's standards. Emma, sitting beside me, looked mortified. "Mom, please. Daniel has his own successful career." "I'm sure he does, dear," Margaret replied with a patronizing smile. "But there are different levels of success, aren't there?" That dinner set the tone for the next 6 years of my relationship with Margaret Whitmore. She never openly attacked me. That would have been beneath her social breeding. But she waged a subtle campaign of psychological warfare designed to undermine my relationship with Emma and drive me away from her daughter. When Emma and I moved in together after 2 years of dating, Margaret expressed concern about Emma settling down too early. When I proposed 3 years later, she worried aloud about Emma limiting her options. When we started planning our wedding, she questioned every decision we made, from the venue to the guest list to the menu. But Margaret's interference went far beyond wedding planning. She had an uncanny ability to create crises that required Emma's immediate attention, usually at the most inconvenient times. She would have health scares that turned out to be nothing, emergencies with her house that required Emma to drop everything and rush to Westchester, and urgent family matters that somehow always coincided with our important plans. The pattern became clear. Whenever Emma and I were growing closer, whenever we were making progress in our relationship, Margaret would manufacture a crisis that pulled Emma away from me and back into her orbit. The worst part was that Emma couldn't see what her mother was doing. She'd grown up with Margaret's manipulations and had learned to accept them as normal maternal behavior. When I tried to point out the pattern, Emma would defend her mother, saying she was just going through a difficult time or needed extra support. Margaret was brilliant at playing the victim. She would make cutting remarks about me, then act hurt when I responded. She would create problems, then position herself as the one trying to solve them. She would undermine our relationship, then express concern about our communication issues. The breaking point came during our wedding planning. Emma and I had chosen a beautiful venue in the Hudson Valley, a historic mansion with gardens overlooking the river. It was perfect for us, elegant but not ostentatious, with room for our 150 guests and a reasonable price that fit our budget. Margaret hated it. "It's so rustic," she said when we showed her the photos. "Are you sure this is the image you want to project? What will people think?" When we stood firm on our choice, Margaret launched a campaign to change our minds. She discovered problems with the venue. The parking was inadequate, the acoustics were poor, the catering options were limited. She found alternative venues that were twice as expensive and completely wrong for us, then acted hurt when we rejected her suggestions. But Margaret's masterstroke came 6 weeks before the wedding. She announced that she'd been diagnosed with a heart condition and needed immediate surgery. The timing, she said, meant she might not be able to attend our wedding. Emma was devastated. She wanted to postpone the wedding, but I was suspicious. Margaret's heart condition had appeared conveniently just as we were finalizing details for a wedding she disapproved of. When I suggested we get a second medical opinion, Emma accused me of being heartless and unsupportive. The surgery, when it finally happened, revealed nothing more serious than a minor arrhythmia that required no treatment. Margaret made a miraculous recovery just days after our wedding, which we'd postponed by 3 months at Emma's insistence. That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a difficult mother-in-law. I was dealing with a master manipulator who would stop at nothing to control her daughter's life and drive me out of it. The final straw came 2 years after our wedding, when Emma and I started trying to have children. We'd been trying for 8 months without success, and Emma was beginning to worry. She'd made an appointment with a fertility specialist, and we were both nervous about what we might learn. The night before the appointment, Margaret called with another emergency. She'd fallen in her garden and thought she might have broken her wrist. She needed Emma to drive her to the hospital immediately. Emma wanted to cancel our appointment and rush to her mother's side. I suggested we call an ambulance or ask Margaret's neighbor to help, but Emma insisted that her mother needed her. We rescheduled the fertility appointment and drove to Westchester. Margaret's broken wrist turned out to be a minor sprain that required nothing more than an ice pack and an over-the-counter pain reliever. But she'd successfully disrupted another important moment in our lives, creating drama and chaos just when Emma and I needed to focus on our future together. As I sat in Margaret's pristine living room, watching her milk sympathy from Emma while dismissing her injury as nothing serious, I felt something cold and calculating settle over me. I'd spent 4 years trying to build a relationship with this woman, 4 years of being polite and respectful while she systematically tried to destroy my marriage. I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offense. The plan I developed was as subtle and sophisticated as Margaret's own manipulations. I couldn't attack her directly. That would only make me look like the villain and drive Emma further into her mother's arms. Instead, I would use Margaret's own weapons against her: manipulation, social pressure, and the careful orchestration of consequences. Phase 1 involved documenting Margaret's behavior. I started keeping a detailed record of her emergencies, her health scares, and her interference in our lives. I noted the timing of each crisis, the excuses she used, and the impact on our relationship. The pattern was undeniable once it was laid out in black and white. I also began recording our conversations. New York is a one-party consent state, which meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of. I started carrying a small digital recorder whenever we visited Margaret, capturing her cutting remarks, her manipulative tactics, and her attempts to undermine our marriage. The recordings were devastating. In private, Margaret was cruel and calculating, making comments about my background, my family, and my worthiness as Emma's husband. She would mock my accent, criticize my clothes, and question my ability to provide for her daughter. But she was careful to make these comments only when Emma was out of earshot. Phase 2 involved building alliances within Margaret's social circle. I started attending more family gatherings and social events, not to please Margaret, but to observe her interactions with others. What I discovered was that Margaret's manipulative behavior wasn't limited to me. She treated everyone in her life as pawns in her personal chess game. Her sister Patricia had been estranged from her for years after Margaret had interfered in her marriage. Her neighbor Helen had stopped socializing with her after Margaret had spread gossip about Helen's daughter. Her former friend Joyce had cut ties after Margaret had tried to sabotage Joyce's charity fundraiser. I reached out to these women not to gossip about Margaret, but to understand her patterns of behavior. What I learned was that Margaret had been manipulating and controlling people for decades. She would identify someone's vulnerabilities, then exploit them for her own purposes. She would create drama and chaos, then position herself as the victim or the hero. Most importantly, I learned that Margaret's greatest fear was public embarrassment. She'd built her identity around her social status and her reputation as a pillar of the community. The thought of being exposed as manipulative or cruel terrified her more than anything else. Phase 3 involved setting traps that would expose Margaret's true nature to Emma and others. I couldn't simply tell Emma what her mother was doing. I had to show her in a way that would be undeniable. The first trap came during Emma's birthday dinner. I'd made reservations at Emma's favorite restaurant, a cozy Italian place in the city where we'd had our first date. Margaret had insisted on joining us, despite Emma's hints that we'd prefer to celebrate alone. During dinner, I casually mentioned that I'd been offered a promotion that would require us to relocate to Chicago. It wasn't true. I'd made up the story specifically to see how Margaret would react. Her response was immediate and revealing. She launched into a tirade about how the move would be terrible for Emma's career, how Chicago was a second-tier city, and how I was being selfish to even consider it. She became increasingly agitated, making comments about my ambition and my disregard for Emma's needs. Emma was shocked by her mother's vehemence, especially since the supposed promotion would have been a significant advancement for my career. For the first time, she saw her mother's reaction as unreasonable and hurtful rather than protective. The second trap was more elaborate. I arranged for Emma and me to have dinner with my parents, who were visiting from Queens. I told Margaret about the dinner, knowing she would find a way to interfere. Sure enough, Margaret called an hour before we were supposed to leave, claiming she was having chest pains and needed Emma to take her to the emergency room. Emma was torn. She didn't want to disappoint my parents, but she was worried about her mother. I suggested we call an ambulance, but Margaret insisted she only trusted Emma to take her to the hospital. Emma reluctantly agreed to cancel our dinner plans, but I'd anticipated this move. I'd asked my parents to arrive early and wait in the lobby of our apartment building. When Margaret called with her emergency, I suggested that Emma take her to the hospital while I explained the situation to my parents. My parents, who are genuinely caring people, immediately offered to accompany us to the hospital to provide support. Margaret couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful, so she found herself trapped in a car with the people she'd been trying to avoid. At the hospital, Margaret's chest pains mysteriously disappeared after a normal EKG. She was embarrassed to be caught in what was obviously a manufactured crisis, especially in front of my parents, who treated her with nothing but kindness and concern. Emma began to see the pattern. Her mother's emergencies always seemed to coincide with important events in our lives, and they always turned out to be nothing serious. She started questioning Margaret's motives and timing. The third trap was the most sophisticated. I knew that Margaret's greatest weakness was her need to control the narrative and maintain her image as a devoted mother. I decided to use her own social circle against her. I arranged for Emma and me to attend Margaret's book club meeting, where she held court among her wealthy friends. During the evening, I steered the conversation toward family relationships and the challenges of being a supportive parent. Margaret, as expected, began holding forth about the sacrifices she'd made for Emma and the challenges of watching her daughter make questionable choices. She made several subtle digs at me, disguised as concerns about Emma's future. But I'd prepared for this moment. I'd brought along a small recording device, and I'd also arranged for Emma to step out of the room at a crucial moment. With Emma gone, Margaret felt free to be more explicit about her disapproval of me. "I just don't understand what Emma sees in him," Margaret said to her friends. "He's from such a different background, and I worry he'll hold her back. She could do so much better." What Margaret didn't know was that Emma had returned and was standing in the doorway, listening to every word. She heard her mother's true feelings about me, expressed in the cruelest possible terms to a room full of strangers. Emma was devastated and furious. She confronted her mother immediately, demanding an explanation for her behavior. Margaret tried to backtrack, claiming she'd been misunderstood, but the damage was done. Emma had finally seen her mother's manipulation for what it was. But I wasn't finished. Margaret had spent years trying to destroy my relationship with Emma, and I wanted her to face real consequences for her actions. Phase 4 involved exposing Margaret's behavior to her broader social circle. I'd learned that Margaret's reputation was built on carefully crafted lies about her relationships and her character. She presented herself as a devoted mother, a loyal friend, and a pillar of the community. But the reality was very different. I began sharing Margaret's recorded comments with the people she'd hurt over the years. Her sister Patricia was particularly interested to hear Margaret's private opinions about her marriage and her children. Her former friends were fascinated to learn what Margaret really thought of them. I also shared the recordings with Emma's extended family, including her father's relatives who had always found Margaret difficult but had never been able to articulate why. They were shocked to hear the cruel and manipulative things she said about people she claimed to love. The social consequences were swift and devastating. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated as people began to understand her true nature. Her book club asked her to step down. Her charity board removed her from her leadership position. Her neighbors stopped inviting her to social events. But the most satisfying consequence was the impact on her relationship with Emma. My wife finally understood the extent of her mother's manipulation and control. She saw how Margaret had been sabotaging our relationship from the beginning, creating crises and manufacturing drama to keep us apart. Emma set firm boundaries with her mother, limiting contact and refusing to be drawn into Margaret's manufactured emergencies. When Margaret tried her usual tactics, fake health scares, emotional manipulation, guilt trips, Emma stood firm. The final blow came when Emma and I announced that we were expecting our first child. Margaret immediately tried to insert herself into our pregnancy, offering unsolicited advice and making demands about her role as grandmother. But Emma was ready for her. She told Margaret that her behavior over the past 6 years had damaged their relationship beyond repair, and that she wouldn't allow her mother to manipulate and control her grandchild the way she tried to control Emma. Margaret was banned from our baby shower, excluded from our birth plan, and told that her access to her grandchild would depend on her ability to respect our boundaries and treat me with basic human decency. The woman who had spent years trying to drive me away from her daughter found herself on the outside looking in, watching as Emma and I built the family she tried so hard to prevent. 6 months after our son was born, I sat in our living room, watching Emma read to our baby while Margaret's latest guilt trip voicemail played in the background. Emma had stopped answering her mother's calls, and Margaret's messages had become increasingly desperate and manipulative. "She says she's dying," Emma said, looking up from the book. "Again. 3rd time this month," I replied. "Remember when she was dying of that mysterious illness that turned out to be seasonal allergies?" Emma laughed, but there was sadness in her eyes. Despite everything Margaret had done, Emma still loved her mother and grieved for the relationship they could have had. "I know she's toxic," Emma said. "I know she tried to destroy us, but sometimes I wonder if I'm being too harsh." I understood Emma's conflict. Margaret was still her mother, and the bonds of family are powerful even when they're poisoned by manipulation and control. But I also knew that protecting our family meant maintaining the boundaries we'd established. "You're not being harsh," I said gently. "You're being healthy. You're breaking a cycle that's probably been going on for generations." Emma nodded, but I could see she was still struggling with guilt and doubt. Margaret's final manipulation was making Emma question her own judgment and her right to protect herself and her family. That's when I realized that my war with Margaret wasn't over. She might be isolated and excluded, but she was still trying to manipulate Emma through guilt and emotional blackmail. She was still trying to regain control over her daughter's life. I decided it was time for one final confrontation. I drove to Margaret's house on a Saturday afternoon, knowing Emma was at her sister's baby shower and wouldn't be available to mediate. Margaret answered the door looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. but her eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had made her such a formidable opponent. "Daniel," she said, clearly surprised to see me. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, "about Emma, about our son, and about your future role in our lives." Margaret invited me in, probably hoping she could manipulate me the way she'd manipulated Emma for so many years. But I wasn't the same man who'd nervously shaken her hand at that first Thanksgiving dinner. I'd learned her tactics, understood her weaknesses, and developed my own strategies for dealing with her. "I know what you've been doing," I said, sitting across from her in her pristine living room. "The guilt trips, the emotional manipulation, the attempts to make Emma question her decisions. It's not going to work anymore." Margaret tried to play innocent, claiming she didn't know what I was talking about. But I'd brought copies of her recorded comments, transcripts of her manipulative voicemails, and documentation of her years of interference in our relationship. "You've spent 6 years trying to destroy my marriage," I continued. "You've lied, manipulated, and emotionally abused your own daughter in an attempt to control her life. And now you're trying to use guilt and fake illnesses to regain that control." Margaret's mask finally slipped. The sweet, concerned mother act disappeared, replaced by the cold, calculating woman I'd always known she was. "You don't deserve her," she said, her voice filled with venom. "You're nothing but a working-class nobody who got lucky. Emma could have married anyone, a doctor, a lawyer, someone with real prospects. Instead, she settled for you. And that's exactly why you'll never have a relationship with your grandson," I replied calmly. "Because you can't see past your own prejudices and social climbing to recognize what actually matters. Emma is happy. She's successful. She's building a life with someone who loves and respects her. But that's not enough for you because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of success." I stood to leave, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You think you've won," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "But Emma will come back to me. She always does. I'm her mother. And that bond is stronger than whatever you think you have with her." I turned back to face her, and for the first time in 6 years, I smiled at Margaret Whitmore. "You're right about one thing," I said. "Emma will always love you, because that's the kind of person she is. But she'll never trust you again. She'll never let you control her again. And she'll never let you hurt her family again. You had the chance to be part of something beautiful, Emma's life, our marriage, your grandson's childhood. But you chose control over love, manipulation over acceptance. And now you'll spend the rest of your life watching from the sidelines as we build the family you tried so hard to destroy." I left Margaret sitting in her perfect living room, surrounded by the symbols of the social status that mattered more to her than her daughter's happiness. She'd won the battle for appearances but lost the war for Emma's heart. As I drove home to my wife and son, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't experienced in years. The mother-in-law war was finally over, and I'd emerged victorious not through cruelty or manipulation, but by protecting the people I loved and refusing to let Margaret's toxicity poison our lives. Emma was waiting for me when I got home, our son sleeping peacefully in her arms. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's over," I said, kissing her forehead. "She knows where she stands, and she knows it's not going to change." Emma nodded, looking relieved. "I got 3 more voicemails while you were gone. I deleted them without listening." "Good," I said. "You don't need that poison in your life anymore." As we sat together in our living room, watching our son sleep, I reflected on the long journey that had brought us to this point. Margaret had tried to destroy us, but in the end, her attacks had only made our relationship stronger. We'd learned to communicate better, to trust each other more deeply, and to protect our family from toxic influences. The mother-in-law war had taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so strong and beautiful that your enemies can't touch it. Margaret had lost not because I destroyed her, but because I'd helped Emma build a life that didn't need her approval or involvement. Our son stirred in Emma's arms, opening his eyes and looking up at his parents with the trust and innocence that Margaret had tried so hard to corrupt. He would grow up knowing he was loved unconditionally, supported completely, and protected fiercely from anyone who tried to manipulate or control him. That was my victory over Margaret Whitmore. Not her isolation or her social downfall, but the family we built despite her best efforts to tear us apart. She declared war on our happiness, and we'd responded by creating something she could never destroy: a love built on respect, trust, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The mother-in-law war was over, and love had won.